Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's special topic webinar on filth flies. Before we get started, I'm going to make a few announcements. Please, everyone, mute your line. If you become unmuted, please remute yourself. We'll take all questions at the end of this webinar. If you could put them in the chat. If you have a question that you remember after the webinar, you can email us at education@nola.gov. And if you're a Louisiana sanitarian, this webinar will count for CEU credits. I'm going to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Carrie Cottone. Dr. Carrie Cottone has been employed by the City of New Orleans Mosquito, Termite, and Rodent Control Board for the past 18 years. Her career with the city began just 2 months before Hurricane Katrina hit. Carrie spearheaded the efforts to create a working insect genetics lab for the New Orleans Mosquito Control, as well as efforts to begin using molecular methods to screen Aedes aegypti mosquitoes for insecticide resistance. She received her PhD in entomology in 2011 as a distance education student at the University of Florida. Carrie is currently the assistant director at the New Orleans Mosquito Control. Her responsibilities include holding a supervisory role, assisting with budget, acting as a liaison for collaborators, drafting protocols, and executing research to test new products, grant writing, and initiating contracts. And now, Dr. Cottone.
Oh, thank you so much for that introduction. Thank you very much. And thank you everybody for wanting to spend your afternoon with me talking about filth flies. I know it's not something that everybody gets excited about like I do, but for me, this is really kind of a blast from the past, right? So when I was getting my master's degree, it was all about filth flies and poultry houses in Arkansas. So I'm very happy to be giving this presentation today. So filth flies, first and foremost, they are incredibly important to our environment and our ecosystem, right? This group of insects includes mosquitoes, which we're not going to really be talking about today, but flies as an order includes mosquitoes, making flies the most important vectors of animal and human disease. Okay, they're very important in our ecosystems. Flies serve as food for reptiles, amphibians, and birds. They help break down organic matter. Filth flies, by their nature, will feed on and breed in decaying organic matter. So they help our environment by kind of continuing that recycling process and breaking down organic matter and releasing those nutrients back into the soil. They can also be used in forensic entomology, right? So that's kind of a field that's been made famous by recent television shows. So, determining the time of death can be determined by filth flies as well. So all flies belong to the order Diptera. Diptera means two wings. So you have di meaning two and ptera meaning wing. So instead of having two pairs of wings or four wings, they have one pair of wings. Their hind wings are modified into what are called halteres. They're these little knob-like structures. And these are used as kind of a gyroscope. So they allow flies to know where they are in relation to the ground. It allows them to become very strong flyers. Flies have a complete metamorphosis. So much like butterflies, there's an egg, larva, pupa, and adult stages. But I kind of wanted to let you see these halteres a little bit better. So I have a better picture for you. So here you can see the red arrow pointing to this fly's haltere. Like I said, these allow flies to be very strong flyers. In fact, if they are ever removed, which has been done in scientific studies in the past and filmed, flies don't really fly around. They kind of tumble. They're kind of doing these aerodynamic acrobatics where they're just kind of tumbling around and they're not really sure where they are in relationship to the ground. Okay, so filth flies, which we're going to be talking about today, includes flies like our house flies, our bottle flies, our stable flies, fruit flies, all the flies that you're used to seeing in and around your home, right? And they get their name because they are absolutely filthy, right? So they are known to feed on and breed in decaying organic matter. And what does that mean exactly? Decaying organic matter can be anything from trash, food trash in your garbage cans, to food that is stuck in a clogged sink drain, to any kind of animal waste you might have in your backyard, from letting Scruffy outside to use the bathroom. Okay, so they are very important when it comes to mechanical transmission of pathogens. Okay, and they're really good at mechanical transmission. So when I say mechanical transmission, I'm not talking about how, say, a mosquito can spread disease, right? You have an insect like a mosquito, it's going to take a blood meal, ingest a virus. That virus is going to replicate within its system, and the next time it bites, it's going to be able to transfer that virus onto its next host. This is totally different. This is very, very basic. With mechanical transmission of pathogens, you have a fly that is feeding on or breeding in this decaying organic matter. Their bodies are covered in all these little tiny fine hairs. They have foot pads that are very, very sticky. I'm sure all of us have seen a housefly climb a wall or walk across your ceiling. They have these foot pads with what's called pulvilli on there. It makes them very sticky. So they're able to pick up all of these different bacteria on their bodies. And the next time they land somewhere, they're able to transfer that bacteria off of their bodies. Okay, so I have a little animation here for you. So let's say you have at your neighbor's house, you have little Scruffy there who's going outside to use the bathroom because he's a good boy and he's, house trained. And so you have flies buzzing around that. They're very attracted to that. And you might be having your own friends over in your backyard for a barbecue. So that same fly that was visiting your neighbor's backyard when little Scruffy was doing his business is now going to visit your outdoor barbecue. Okay, this is how pathogens are transmitted by filth flies. Filth flies, depending on the species, can be non-biting or biting. Okay, I love this diagram right here. It shows the head of a housefly versus a stable fly. So the housefly is pictured on the left, so it has those sponging mouth parts. And biting flies, such as stable flies, will have piercing mouth parts. As you can see in this diagram, those mouth parts are definitely modified for their purpose, right? You can definitely tell the difference between a sponging mouth part and a piercing mouth part. And here we have some photographs on the left. You can see a fly with sponging mouth parts sucking up a meal, right? So flies with sponging mouth parts, they cannot feed on solid food. So they will they will create a little vomit droplet and actually place that on the food to kind of pre-digest it before it sucks it up. I know I really should have warned folks right before I started talking about all this stuff. If you just had lunch, I do apologize. It's not the prettiest of topics at times, but I think in pest control it is quite necessary to talk about. Um, with piercing mouth parts, you can see that there is a definite difference with the stable fly on the right side of the picture. So those piercing mouth parts are very, very sharp. It's very different from a mosquito. I think most of us are familiar with how a mosquito feeds. It's more like a hypodermic needle where its mouth parts actually go inside the skin and then they will take a blood meal from that. This is completely different. Piercing mouth parts with filth flies, think of it more as like a cutting utensil or a knife where it will actually break the skin. And as the blood pools on the surface of the skin, it will start lapping up that blood meal. Okay, so they can be pretty painful bites as well. Like I said, the life cycle of a housefly, it goes through complete metamorphosis. So you have egg, larva, pupa, and adult. This can happen pretty quickly. It can live its entire life within a matter of weeks. And when we talk about, first, second, and third instar larvae here, so these are maggots. Okay, so filth fly larvae are called maggots. So that's what I'm going to be referring to them as. And they are these little worm-like structures. Okay, so here we have a close-up picture of one. And I kind of want to make at least this slide a little bit interactive. So which end do you think has the mouth parts attached to it? Is it A or B? I was hoping that people might be able to type in an answer here in the chat. We might be able to get a little bit of interactiveness going here. I see B, B, A, B, okay. Okay, so I'm seeing both answers here in the chat. I really appreciate you guys kind of playing along with me here today. So it is actually A. So the left-hand side, the pointy side, is where you're going to find the mouth parts. Okay, and those mouth parts kind of act like hooks. It allows this maggot to move along the surface of what it's feeding on to kind of dig in, and it can actually get buried in whatever substrate it's feeding on. Whereas the blunt end, the larger end, B, that's where its hind end is. And that's where it breathes from, actually. So if you have this, filth fly maggot, the blunt end, if you look at that under a microscope, you can actually tell what species you're dealing with, okay, by the placement of these breathing holes. Okay, so these breathing holes are called spiracles. They are located on the hind end of that maggot so that while it's eating, and it has its mouth hooks on that tapered end, and it can bury itself mostly in whatever it's feeding on, it can have its hind end outside of that material, and it's comparable to saying that it can breathe out its rear, okay, in that respect. So it's a very efficient way for it to feed and breathe at the same time. Another very interesting thing that I find about the fly's life cycle is how it emerges from its pupal case. So its life cycle, of course, is egg, larva, pupa, and adult. And these really hard pupal cases can be a little bit tricky for an adult fly to emerge from. So essentially, it has a balloon-like structure on the front of its head that expands and breaks open that pupal case and allows the adult fly to emerge. Now, I know none of us have seen a lot of house flies in the wild with this bubble coming off the top of its head. So that bubble will actually shrink. And if you look at a fly's, the front of its head under a microscope, you can actually see what is called a talinal suture. So it looks like an upside down U or a horseshoe, and that is what that suture is from. So I do have a video here. I'm hoping, I'm hoping I can get it to play. I got it to play earlier. Okay. So this is something available on YouTube. It's just a quick 1 minute. There's no sound. It's, time lapse of the life cycle of a fly. I find this quite interesting. You can see here the maggot crawling along, moving those front mouth hooks. This, of course, is time lapse of a pupal case hardening over time. It gets darker as it hardens. And it's, very dramatic, these flies feeding on these decaying carcasses and such. But what I found so interesting is this here is how an adult fly emerges from its pupal case. So that is that balloon-like structure on the front of its head. You can see those large red spots right there. Those are the eyes. So it's like its whole head kind of expands there. And then once that structure shrinks, then that fly will end up with that talinal suture. But that is how they emerge from their pupal case. So very, very interesting. Yeah, so it can be a struggle, but that is one feature that they have to get out of that case. All right. So moving along to some characteristics used for identification for several of these filth fly species. We, of course, are going to start with the house fly. Everybody knows this guy, dark stripes on the thorax. If you look at it under a microscope, you will see a sharply angled wing vein. Like we said before, these guys are going to be feeding on and breeding in decaying organic matter. They do have those sponging mouth parts. Like I said, they do not feed on solid food. So of course, if again, feeding on decaying organic matter, you're going to have the potential for that transmission of bacteria to your food, utensils, cups, plates, what have you. They're known to carry many different types of bacteria. I think the last that I read, they've been known to harbor over 100 different species of bacteria on their bodies. But the heavy hitters that I think most people are familiar with is E. coli, Campylobacter, and Salmonella. These are the ones that we hear about in the news. They can cause outbreaks of, food poisoning or food recalls, things like that. Not necessarily fly related when you hear about them in the news, but I think it's interesting to note that flies are very well known to carry these bacteria. Okay, so stable flies very closely resemble our good friend the housefly, except it has biting mouth parts. So we kind of saw this a few slides ago. So both males and females do feed on blood. They will have those painful bites. It's not like that hypodermic needle like a mosquito has. These have cutting, slashing mouth parts, and they'll, feed off of a droplet of blood as it pools on your skin. These guys are going to be breeding in decaying vegetation. So we're talking things like grass clippings and straw and even wet pet food that's been left out. Those are the kinds of things to look out for if you end up having an issue with these guys. So as I continue going on with identification of these flies, just know that I'm always going to be mentioning what they breed in, what kind of substrate, what they like to feed on, because really the first part of controlling flies is really identifying what you're dealing with. And once you identify the species that you're dealing with, you're going to really know a lot better what to look for. Okay, whether it's garbage or a clogged drain or maybe a dead rat in the attic, that kind of stuff. So that's why identification of filth flies is so important when it comes to control. Okay, so flesh flies are very characteristic. They're very easy to spot. They are much larger than a housefly. They have a very diagnostic, very noticeable orange spot on its hind end. The interesting thing about these guys is they don't lay eggs. They will release live maggots onto animal carcasses. These guys are completely attracted to animal carcasses. So if you see these guys around, there's probably a dead rat, maybe a raccoon, a possum, that kind of thing. However, if they are flying around your kitchen, just know that they may have just come from a piece of roadkill, down the block, and they may be, carrying a lot of bacteria on their bodies as well. Drain flies are very unique. I think these guys are adorable. They are small. They have a cute little fuzzy appearance to them. They have these really distinctive elliptical shaped wings, as you can see in this picture here. Mostly a nuisance fly. Okay, they are called drain flies for a reason. They will lay their eggs in drains where there's water, maybe mixed with some food, some organic material. So that is where they get their names from. Their larvae, their maggots, are very diagnostic. They're very long and slender, and they have these nice little dark ridges along the body. So even if you don't see the adults and you see these guys in a drain, you kind of know what's going on. So with something like a drain fly, it takes a little bit more than, say, just running a garbage disposal, flushing it with hot water, that kind of thing. Drains can carry a lot of gunk. And I'm sure everybody on this call, myself included, I've dealt with clogged drains. I don't like to think about what's going on inside of that drain. I know that it can be nasty, but if you have an issue with these larvae or even the adult drain flies, this can be kind of what's going on. So if you ever think about all the different components of a drain, just know that it's not just a straight pipe going down. Okay, you have all these different ridges, all these different lips where food material and things and other things that, flies can feed on can get trapped, along with a wet environment because you're running that faucet. So you have a water source for them and a food source for them and harborage for them. So there are drain cleaners out there, enzymatic drain cleaners and foaming drain cleaners, which can really help knock this problem down. Okay, so fungus gnats is something that we see a lot of. These are small sized flies. Most people just will refer to them as gnats. I have an issue with gnats in my house, that kind of thing. Um, but most of all, they are a nuisance pest, and their larvae are actually the ones feeding on the fungus and decaying organic matter. So if you have an issue with fungus gnats, the first thing that you're going to want to look for is houseplants. So if houseplants are overwatered, this can really cause a big issue. Most of the time, if you have fungus gnats and it's because you've been watering the plants, the fungus gnats probably came with the plant. Okay, one thing that you can do is make sure that these plants aren't getting overwatered. Once a week should be just fine. You can set them outside to dry out for a little bit before bringing them back indoors, and then really just water them once a week. Okay, so midges, we've gotten plenty of phone calls about midges. They do resemble mosquitoes. I know, I guess a couple of years ago, there was a pretty large outbreak because of the lake. We saw these in a pretty large numbers. Yeah, they are mostly a nuisance. They're not biting, they're not really spreading a lot of disease, although they could cause contamination. But most of the time, it's because of misidentification, and people are worried that these are mosquitoes. Not too much you can do about these guys because they're only going to live a short period of time. It's just a matter of washing off your siding or your cars or wherever they end up dying. Okay. Biting midges are another story. These are, again, of small size, but they do have biting mouth parts. They are blood feeders. These guys, instead of fresh water, they will lay their eggs in salt marshes and tree holes and plant debris. And because of where they're found around salt marshes, salt water, that kind of thing, they can become a problem in resort areas because if you're on vacation, nobody wants to be bitten by these guys. Okay, soldier flies. So I don't know if anybody on here has had the pleasure of dealing with these larvae in somebody's home, but it's pretty distinctive once you see it. So these are larger flies. You can see here these little oops, let me go back. White spots underneath the wings there on a dark black body. The larvae are pretty long in length, 20 millimeters, so 2 centimeters, almost an inch long. They can be a nuisance. They can cause issues in sewer systems. Okay, fruit flies. I'm sure everybody here has had fruit flies in their home. These guys are very, very small. Under a microscope, you can see that their eyes are red in color. Okay, so in food service establishments where they have opportunities to feed and breed in a large amount of food, um, you know, you can get large populations of these flies. They lay their eggs near fruit, of course, garbage containers, rotten vegetables, or drains, things like that. So if there is an issue with fruit flies, or there seems to be fruit flies in overabundance, you want to look for things like rotting fruit and vegetables. You want to check the garbage and you want to check the kitchen area. One thing that is unique to New Orleans, I think, and being kind of on the cusp of Mardi Gras season here, I know at least St. Patrick's Day parades, people like to throw vegetables, right, from the floats, either potatoes or cabbages, things like that. And I remember receiving a phone call from somebody who could not figure out where their fruit fly problem was coming from. And I kind of talked it through with them. They didn't have food in their kitchen. I mean, it was a very sparse kitchen and their garbage was picked up regularly. Well, they had gone to a St. Patrick's Day parade and put their bag of goodies that they'd caught from the parade in a closet and kind of forgot about it. Well, there were potatoes in there and carrots in there and cabbage in there, and that's where the fruit flies were coming from. So there's always a source. Flies don't just come out of nowhere, okay? Okay, Ford flies are also called humpback flies because they have this very unique humpbacked appearance. They are very small. They resemble fruit flies. They feed on decaying plant and animal matter. So they can be found in bathrooms and kitchens and garbage containers, things like that. Another issue is moisture problems around plumbing and drains and things like that. Another one that we don't see very often is a cheese skipper. It's about half the size of a housefly. It gets its name because it will lay its eggs on the surface of moldy cheese and spoiled meat. Don't really get a whole lot of phone calls about this one, primarily because if you have meat and cheese that are out and they've spoiled, people tend to get rid of that kind of stuff pretty quickly. Okay, so eye gnats can be a major nuisance for animals, really. So these small flies, they resemble fruit flies or humpback flies. They like the mucous membranes or open wounds. Here in this picture, you can see this poor dog has them all around his eyes, right? They don't bite, but they can be very, very annoying. Most of the time, you find them in areas where there's a lot of animals or livestock, and they like to lay their eggs in decaying vegetation and animal waste, things like that. So black garbage flies are another kind of filth fly. They do look like house flies, but their bodies are completely black and they're shiny. Their larvae are predaceous, so black garbage fly larvae will actually eat larvae of house flies. And I remember there was a time when scientists were kind of looking at um, the idea of releasing black garbage fly larvae to eat housefly larvae in livestock establishments to kind of knock down some of the housefly issues. However, because of where black garbage flies are feeding and breeding as well, they're also mechanical vectors of bacteria. So you're only replacing one problem with another problem, a very similar problem. So if there are issues with black garbage flies, you want to check garbage and rotting food and any kind of animal waste as well. Horn flies are pretty interesting. This is a pest of cattle. So I grew up in the Midwest, so I remember hearing about these things. They do have piercing mouth parts. They feed on blood. Um, they will breed in cow dung. And the way that their life cycle works is they will spend the majority of their time along the backs of cows near the tail end of a cow. And so they're feeding on the cow blood. And if you've ever been to a cattle ranch or a cow farm, you'll know that cows have a very distinct posture right before they do their business, right? They will lift up their tail, and as soon as they do, these horn flies will get super excited because they know, okay, well, there's going to be fresh cow dung soon. So it's actually they've almost, I don't know if it's learned that behavior from a cow, to know that, hey, once that tail goes up, it's time to fly off the cow and wait for the dung to hit the ground, and that's where we can lay our eggs. Blowflies. These are actually quite pretty, I think. They are very shiny, they're metallic in appearance. They come in a variety of colors. They can be blue, they can be green, they can be bronze. Um, they lay their eggs in garbage, but mostly meat and animal carcasses they love. They can be a nuisance, and of course, because of where they're laying their eggs, they can be major mechanical vectors of bacteria. So if there's an issue with blowflies, just know that it could be, think of something that is dead, either spoiled meat in the trash, or maybe there's a rodent under the house, or things like that. One thing is for certain, though, with any of these flies, we're going to be talking a lot about source reduction. Okay, so there are ways to control the flies, but mainly it's going to be source reduction. Okay, and the last kind of fly that I'm going to be really kind of describing here are the horse flies and deer flies. I'm sure some of you on this call have had the absolute pleasure of being bitten by these things. Very painful bite indeed. Um, they are rather large, which means that their mouth parts are large, which means that you have rather large mouth parts that are cutting your skin to take that blood meal. They do have very distinct eyes. It's kind of like a mottled green and brown and orange kind of colors. They lay their eggs on vegetation overhanging water and in other moist areas because their larvae will develop in those wet areas. So we've kind of talked about how filth flies are mechanical, um, can mechanically transmit bacteria and why we don't like them. But has anybody ever wondered if filth flies, what purpose can they serve other than feeding a bunch of amphibians and reptiles and things? Can they be beneficial at all? Well, I'm only going to touch on this just a little bit, but forensic entomology um, has allowed scientists to help determine the time of death at a crime scene. Okay, so forensic entomology has become widely popular with shows such as CSI. We might have some fans on this call today. Um, but it really is a fascinating field if you have an interest in that. And the crux is this, okay? If an animal dies, if a person dies, there is a very predictable succession of insects that will visit a body postpartum. Okay, so within this chart, we can see, if things are still fresh and they haven't, become a skeleton yet. We start out with the califords; those are the blowflies. The muscadies, those are like house flies, and then the flesh flies, the sarcophagids, and then the forward flies, and then anything after that, those are really beetles. Um, but the idea here is if you can figure out temperature and other environmental conditions, you can actually take a sample from that crime scene and backdate it. So let's say you're able to pick up third instar larvae, you know what the environmental conditions have been, the temperature, um, things like that, and then you can actually determine the day that person may have died. Okay, so that's pretty much the crux of forensic entomology. Very, very basic. Not going to get into it too much right now. That could be a webinar all of its own. Another thing that I find fascinating with filth flies, and I'm only going to touch this briefly, um, is something that in the literature is called maggot therapy. Okay, and maggot therapy is um, essentially, it has been used for wound care in the past, and we're kind of seeing an uptick of it here recently. So within the literature, it shows that, after centuries of warfare, a lot of observations were already known that say even in World War I to the Civil War, Revolutionary War, field medics and field surgeons noticed that if somebody was injured and they had an open wound and that wound became infested with maggots, those soldiers actually fared a lot better than those who didn't have those infestations. Not something you would think it would be the opposite, just because when we think of maggots, we know that that's dirty and gross and rotten. That's what we associate it with. But it actually helped clean those wounds. This was a time before antibiotics, before sterile instruments were being used in the field, that kind of stuff. So you would have these maggots only feeding on the necrotic flesh, not the healthy flesh. And so they're taking that kind of technology and kind of implementing it for in special cases, right? These are individuals who may have wounds that just aren't healing properly. Okay, and these wounds can be like secondary to other medical situations that may not be healing those wounds properly. So of course, you don't have to deal with things like antibiotic resistance, things like that. Um, I almost fell down a rabbit hole with this one, but I will say this. They actually have full laboratories that rear flies on sterile media. So these are not, being transferred from the garbage can to, somebody's body. It's a very sterile environment, and only some countries are doing this. But this is an example of a very controlled cases of myiasis, which is a fancy term for uh, basically a maggot infestation on vertebrate tissue. Okay, so what I really want to kind of get to the nitty gritty about is what is sustainable fly management. Okay, so I will say this time and time again, sustainable fly management is sanitation, and good sanitation is sustainable fly management. So when we talk about sanitation, of course, the first thing that comes to mind is things that you put in the garbage can. But it can also be, what happens then? Yeah, you can put things in a garbage can, but if those bags aren't closed, if those containers can't close, you're still going to have an issue with flies, right? And even inside, there's cleaning and then there's really deep cleaning. Okay, we've already kind of discussed foaming drain cleaners that can get into all those nooks and crannies. Well, when you're talking about fly management, you really want to do a good, solid deep clean. So it can be, looking under the refrigerator, under your stove for bits of food, bits of, dog food, anything that a fly can feed on. It doesn't take much to sustain a bunch of fly maggots, okay? Um, and this certainly isn't to point the finger at anybody. I couldn't tell you the last time I pulled my fridge out and cleaned under it, and it probably could use it. So, right? So, when we are talking about sustainable fly management, I really want you to think of elimination of those breeding areas. So, we've talked a lot about different species breeding in different kinds of substrates or different vegetations. Um, so sustainable fly management is really source reduction and elimination of their breeding areas, elimination of their food supply, right? So that can be anything from, if buildings have to remain open, of course, a screen is ideal, but if they have to remain open, there are air curtains that are available, basically just an air stream that would keep flies outside. Okay. Regularly removing garbage, sealing garbage cans, addressing any kind of moisture problems, right? Flies need water too. Every living thing does. Um, and it's amazing. Once you get sanitation involved in pest control, it's more than just flies that you're going to um, be preventing, right? Agriculture areas can be pretty difficult when it comes to fly control, though. If you think of a cattle ranch or a farm, you're gonna have manure, you're gonna have feed, right? So how do you handle that? Um, it can be difficult unless that manure can be removed frequently. Feed needs to stay dry, and the things just need to be kept clean on a regular basis, if at all possible. Source reduction can also mean removing grass clippings, decaying vegetation, wet pet food that's been outside, all that stuff. And some people, I know that they like their compost piles. Um, and if their compost piles are maintained properly, there shouldn't be a fly problem. Um, but let's say somebody's kind of new at the composting game. They're trying to set something up in their backyard, and they're putting some food waste in there. If a fly problem does occur, that's a pretty easy fix. You wouldn't have to necessarily get rid of your compost pile. You can cover it with a tarp for a couple days, let that compost heat up enough to the point to kill off any kind of fly larvae that might be living within there. Okay, there are larvicides and insecticides that can be used for helping to control flies. Foaming drain cleaners, drip systems, other kinds of baits and residual pesticides as well. But again, this kind of fly management, or this kind of treatment, if this is the only thing that you're using, just know that the problems are not going to get solved. Okay, these are short-term solutions for an ongoing problem. Okay, other things that folks like to use are fly traps. Traps come in all different shapes and sizes. This one pictured here, it is meant to look like a wall sconce, like a lighting fixture. Okay, but it contains a sticky trap. The light is used to attract the flies. Um, and certainly, I've seen these in some food establishments, things like that. These things can certainly supplement other management strategies, but again, nothing is going to be solved unless the root cause of your fly problem is eliminated. So unless you eliminate their source of food and their breeding areas, the problem is not going to be completely solved. People love their fly traps, though. This is another example of one. So these bag traps where adult flies can go in and then they can't find their way out. A lot of these come with an attractant that will help lure flies to the trap. Now, if you think about what might attract a fly, decaying organic matter, spoiled meat, all this gross stuff that we've talked about, just know that these traps are going to smell foul. They will attract a lot of flies. But one thing to think about is if you hang one of these right outside your back door, first of all, you're going to be smelling it. Second of all, you might be attracting more flies than you would without a trap at all. So if you're going to use these, fine, just know that you might want to move it to the opposite side of your yard, because you're not going to want to deal with the smell or having, thousands of flies right at your back door. So a bug zapper was a favorite of mine growing up. I grew up a child of the 80s in the Midwest, and these were the go-to evening entertainment, right? So some of you, if you're like me, you remember these. I know that there are kind of other forms of this out there today. There are, bug zappers that look like tennis rackets, and you can hit an insect with them and it'll electrocute it. So this electrocution method, it can be used to supplement other management practices, but you need to know if you're going to be electrocuting an insect, that insect is going to essentially explode. And all those body parts covered in all that bacteria from wherever it came from is going to basically be aerosolized. Okay, so this is not something that I would highly recommend. But like I said, if you take home any message of the day, again, sanitation is sustainable fly management. Sustainable fly management is sanitation. Okay, everything else can be used in the short term, but really the long term, it's all about picking up your garbage. Um, getting rid of those breeding areas that flies love to land on and lay their eggs in and feed on, that kind of stuff. So with that, I want to thank everybody for their time today, for your time and attention. I'm happy to take any questions. Stacy, if you want to check the chat to see if anybody has any questions.
I'm not seeing any right now, but people may be typing.
Oh, of course. Yes, and speaking of sanitation being pest control, this might be a good segue into our next rodent control symposium.
Right. So on this Thursday at 2 p.m., we'll be talking about integrated rodent management. Two of our specialists here will be giving a lecture about how to do all kind of IPM. So once again, that is this Thursday, January 25th, from 2 to 3:30, same time as today. Also, for those of you who may have joined in for part one of our rodent control series, we will be re-recording that and posting that on our YouTube shortly. So look out for that. We have some questions in the chat now, Carrie. The first question is, from what I gather, no insecticides are recommended.
All right, well, that's not really what my point is here. So there are insecticides that are labeled for fly control, absolutely. Make sure that the label is being followed at all times. But what I will say is, even if you spray an insecticide, even with a residual, you might be affecting the adults, you might be affecting the larvae. You're not so much going to be affecting the eggs or the pupae, so you're still going to have that ongoing issue. You can use insecticides, you can use traps, you can use different management strategies, but really getting to the root of where these flies are breeding and what they're feeding on, um, until you can get to the root of that issue, use these other fly management strategies as kind of a short-term solution. I hope that answered your question.
The next question is there a length of time from when the housefly lands until it vomits?
Oh my gosh, that's an awesome question, right? That's almost like the 5-second rule if you drop something. So, I mean, I'm sure it varies. Like a fly isn't going to just land and immediately just vomit all over your potato salad that you're hoping to enjoy at a barbecue, right? But it is going to land on your food. And even if it doesn't, still think it could still be harboring bacteria and transmitting it. And, just something to think about. But there's no designated length of time that I'm aware of.
With the increasing use of soldier flies in composting, has anyone seen issues with those flies? Are there any good pages out there with good information for people who want to start a soldier fly compost colony?
I don't really have an answer for that, but I know what I want to look at now. I'm assuming that you're talking about using soldier fly larvae in um, helping the decomposition of your compost pile. I mean, it's an interesting thought. Those larvae are eventually going to be turning into adults. I mean, as long as we just stay cognizant that yeah, their bodies are still going to be covered in bacteria and things like that. But I mean, that's a very interesting thought. No, I might need to look up some of that information and get back to you if possible.
Someone commented, just wondering if was any focus on checking fly monitors at different locations in a food plant to help with identifying the source.
Oh, no, they're as far as fly monitors, so we had discussed like the fly traps that can be placed in different locations to kind of supplement other fly management strategies, and a glue board that looks like a sconce lamp, that type of things. But yeah, one thing to do with those monitors is to really look to be able to identify what fly species you're dealing with, right? We are, um, we've looked at several different species today, which will breed in some varying locations. So if you know exactly what you're dealing with, then you're going to know what the root cause is, if their numbers seem to fluctuate, if they increase or decrease in any way. So yes, that's a very good point.
Do biting flies need the blood meals for reproducing like mosquitoes?
Not necessarily. There are some fly species where both the male and the female will bite. It's a protein boost. Um, but other fly species they do. It's just the females taking the blood meal. So it really kind of just depends on the species.
In restaurants, there is filth that occurs, but the drains are an issue. Other than a chemical in the drain, is there any other strategies to eliminate flies in the drains?
Um, when they say chemical, I'm assuming that they're talking about like a foaming cleaner. I mean, there are enzymatic cleaners out there that are used for purposes such as these. It's yeah, because it's not necessarily let's just put in a bunch of larvicide into a drain to kill the flies. There's, foaming cleaners to get all the inside gunk cleared out of that drain within every little crack and crevice that could be within that drain. Something that foams and something that cleans would be my recommendation.
Yes, someone followed up in the chat. There are power cleaners for drains that work very well in getting rid of accumulations.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic.
Someone comment, the type of fly is really critical. I once had to address a problem with midges and found out they were breeding and ponding on the roof. When this was corrected, the problem was solved.
Oh my gosh, thank you for that comment. It really is, it just kind of goes to show you that if you can get to the source, because otherwise you would just be spraying for midges when all you had to do is find the root cause. So I mean, granted, finding the root cause can be a challenge. It can be like putting a puzzle together at times, but it is very well worth it.
Okay, someone else commented, I'm in the Caribbean and we often get complaints of flies that are attracted to particular trees during certain times of the year. From your presentation, they look like blowflies.
Okay, well, yeah, the blowflies, those are the ones that are very metallic and very shiny. I'd be interested to know what kind of trees they're interested in, though. Blowflies are typically attracted to carrion, dead things. Um, but yeah, if they're attracted to a particular tree, I'd kind of like to know about it. I think that's very interesting.
Any general approach that is effective for flies that live in sewer lines of restaurants, for example? P-traps are not readily accessible for cleaning.
Um, that live in sewer lines of. Mm, I mean, it may take well, let's see, we've talked about foaming drain cleaners, things like that. Anything that foams should be a great help. Enzymatic cleaner should be a very great help. But yeah, if you want, let's see, I can even go back a slide for anybody who wants some more specific information. If I'm answering questions and I'm only drawing up more questions, I have my direct email address up on the screen right now, cbcottone@nola.gov.
Okay. Someone else also commented, I manage pest control in a large food plant. Had more than 40 fly traps. The data revealed the problems of entry.
Data revealed problems of entry. So is that more along the lines of, there are power, and it also says there are power cleaners for drains that work very well in getting rid of accumulate. Okay. Yeah, so those fly traps, as long as you're taking data off of them and you're finding out what fly species it is, that can help direct you to a source of the problem, and also the number of flies in certain areas of that building. I'd love to kind of see those results a little bit more. I wonder um if the data that you gathered from those fly traps let you know where some exclusion methods needed to take place. If there were some openings to the building that people didn't realize. I'd be very interested in seeing that.
Okay. Another comment is, if you know, what university has the best program for forensic entomology?
Oh, I don't know. I know it's fascinating. That I would have to look up. I would hate to give a biased answer because I could I could just say University of Florida for everything, but right, because I'm a little bit biased there. But that would take some Googling to find out which program has a good forensic entomology program. And I know that there are some places that offer like a certificate, and there are other places that might offer a full degree. So it really kind of depends on what you're going for.
Someone mentioned in the chat there is an excellent handbook on common pest flies published by Pest Control Technology. It's a great resource and very inexpensive.
It is a great resource. I would love to agree with that.
And I think that's all the questions I see in the chat.
Okay.
So once again, we just want to thank everyone for coming to our webinar today on filth flies. We will be posting this recording on our YouTube channel. If you have any other questions for Dr. Cottone, you can either email her at her direct email on the screen, or you can email us at education@nola.gov and we can get the question to her. Once again, our part 2 of our rodent control series is this Thursday at 2 p.m. If you would like to sign up, you can either scan the QR code on your screen or also email me at education@nola.gov. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you.